Mitchell Martin. There is no one size that fits all.
Thanks very much. They're purely metaphorical spaceships, by the way. I don't throw actual people out of spaceships. Hi. As we said, my name is Mitchell Martin. I am a user experience designer at DB Results. If you're wanting to know what a user experience designer is, or typically pick one out of a crowd, they're often the person that's wearing like the hoodie and the really, really low jeans. But because I'm presenting today, I was told I had to dress up, so I wore a shirt. So as I said, I work for a consultancy called DB Results, and DB Results has a background working in the utilities, health, and finance sectors. So I've had a lot of great opportunities over the 2.5 years that I've worked there to put my user experience brain to work. But for the last 18 months, I've been contracted to the NDIA, so the National Disability Insurance Agency. A user experience designer, they do just that. They design experience from the perspective of a user, and that's basically what my talk's going to focus on today. The National Disability Insurance Agency. So for those who don't know, it's a scheme implemented by the Australian government, and they're responsible for funding the disabled peoples of Australia. And so typically they would sit with someone, a participant of the scheme, so someone who's on the scheme, and they would organise funding for a 12-month period. So that person can go out and either engage in their community or attain a better quality of life than they otherwise could without those funds. For purposes of this talk, I'll be referring to them as the NDIA, or the NDIS is the scheme that they implement. There are a lot of words inside the agency that will get you caught up. That will become evident as I talk. There's clearly someone in the crowd who knows the scheme and knows how complicated it can be. So there are two things I want you to take away today from this presentation. Primarily, the first is, what does a user experience designer do? So what do I do? What's the process and what's the toolkit that I use to achieve a successful outcome? And the second is, how has my work over the last 18 months with the NDIA influenced that? Because it certainly has. So as I mentioned, I'm a user experience designer, and to that extent, I follow a process, and this process is broken down really into three main criteria: understanding, ideating, and validating. To understand someone, though, really it's important that we empathize with the people that we're dealing with. And so empathy is... sorry, I forgot my spot. If any of you are feeling really awkward right now, receding into the back of your chairs, got butterflies in your stomach, that's empathy. You guys are sitting here feeling empathy for me on stage when I lose my place in my presentation. And it's great if you're all feeling that way, because it means you'll be great designers. The reason that we empathize with people is because it allows us to walk in their shoes. And as a user experience designer, the primary thing that we do is solve problems. But we need to solve the right problems. And we can't do that unless we understand those problems from the perspective of the person experiencing them. It's very evident, especially in big business today, that a business will approach a problem thinking that they understand it in its entirety, only to deliver on that and then deliver a solution that doesn't meet the needs of the people. So that's why we empathize, and that's the first step. So the second step is ideating. So once we've empathized with the user, we sit down and we think about ways in which we can solve that problem. This is fun because you can dream big. It's where you hear all about the green fields and teleportation. And then we go back to the user with these ideas and we say, hey, we've got a couple of ideas. We really want to work with you to understand whether those ideas solve your problems, whether they solve the right problem. And we do all this because when we understand the users, we can start to see some commonalities that exist between them. Users have, well, there's two types of problems. There's problems that are experienced by the group, and there's problems that are experienced by the individual. If we try and solve the individual's problems, we'll be here till the cows come home. So we try and group people, work out what commonality sits between those people, and we solve for that. And that typically looks like, on any other project I've worked on, really you might have two specific user groups out of 1,000 people. because they all share something in common. So you're then trying to solve those problems. So we use this process to understand what that typical user looks like, and we solve for that. So I mentioned that we have a toolkit. So this is the toolkit that we used working on the NDIA, and I'll kind of get to the project in a little bit. But the first part of the toolkit is you always need user groups. It's been mentioned before already at the conference, but you really need to put yourself in the shoes of the user. You can't solve without them. We understand their problems by conducting interviews, and then conducting those interviews allows us to produce two artifacts, well, in the case of the NDIA, two very important artifacts. And these artifacts are used so that if we happen to leave the project, or if it's a particularly long project with a lot of different stakeholders, we make sure that a common understanding of our users is retained throughout the entire course of the project. That way, we're never losing sight of what the real problem is. There's no room for interpretation if everyone understands commonly what the problem is. So a journey map, if you've heard of what a journey map is before, it's really this is the experience we would expect our user to have when engaging with that system or service. These are the high points, these are the low points. And if we understand the low points, we can work out ways of improving them. The other one, which is what I really, really want to focus on today, is persona. So hands up if you know what a persona is. Love it! That's so good. That's so good. You said finding your people, my people. For those who don't know, a persona is the common understanding of your users. So it is the aggregation of 1,000 people into a fictitious profile of one person, Sally or whoever it may be. And Sally represents those 1,000 people. So when you're designing on the project going forward, you're like, I'm solving for Sally, but really you're solving for 1,000 people. Personas is what I want to talk about today. So as I mentioned, I've been working with the NDIA for the last 18 months. We were working on a project called the Planning Pathways Project. NDIA love their P terms. I have no idea why that's the case, but I could put an entire 30-minute slide deck together about just the words that start with P used at the NDIA. So the Planning Pathways Project was us, DB Results, taking a look at the experience of a participant first onboarding to the scheme with the NDIA, and the process of sitting down with a planner, another P term, and the planner would put together a plan, another P term, and that plan would have a budget. And that budget really represents, well, this is the money you've got for the next 12 months to go out and engage with providers, another P term, in the community for services that are going to improve your quality of life over the next 12-month period. So as part of this project, we got to sit down and talk to a lot of people, and Pete and Ryan were two of the people that we spoke to. Pete and Ryan are both planners that work for the Brotherhood of St. Lawrence, so they're responsible for putting these budgets together along with the participant. So I approached this meeting thinking, fantastic, I've got the opportunity to sit down with two people, and both these people are planners, so there's already some commonality there. Pete and Ryan are both 35. They're both planners. They're both deaf. Both make the same super contribution. However, Pete, his native language is Auslan, and Ryan's native language is English. So as it turns out, Pete was born deaf. And so when he went to school, from a very early age, learnt Auslan. Ryan, however, acquired his disability in an accident when he was 5. And so he already had a good understanding of the English language. Now this scared me as a UX designer. So I said, we're looking for commonality. And here are two individuals who share a significant amount in common, as you could see by the superannuation gag. How do I use my toolkit to create a persona that accurately represents these two individuals when they have fundamentally different ways of communicating? And so we played with this idea. We went back to our toolkit. We said, okay, well, we need to produce personas in some manner. And so we came up with this idea that eventually formed into a Rubik's Cube. And I'll tell you how it plays out. Basically, a persona was broken down into 3 facets. you would have a disability facet, you would have a role facet, because we were working internally to the agency at this point on internal agency projects, and you would have a lifestyle facet. The lifestyle facet being, do you spend a lot of your time on computers? Do you go running on the weekends? Anything that might affect your ability in the scenario that was given. And our idea was that by combining one of each of these facets, we get an entire persona. And somewhere along the line took on the form of a Rubik's Cube, because I find Rubik's Cubes complicated and this situation was complicated, but one of my colleagues was like, nah, if you just twist it this way and solve it to this equation, you get a fully blown persona. I still didn't understand it. The problem with this approach, though, was we started to develop personas that were more representing an individual than they were representing, say, a cohort of 1,000 people. We're starting to get preferences in here where we're talking about this is what they do on the weekend, and this is what they do for work, and this is the disability that they have. So we're going back to the drawing board of solving for an individual instead of solving for a group of individuals. And the NDIA at the moment has about 250,000 participants on it, with a scope to about 450,000 in the next 2 years. So this is an example of what one of those facets looked like. So this is Lucy, the Lucy facet for low vision and disability. So you can see here there's some technology that Lucy would use, some pain points and some key needs, all from the perspective of someone who has low vision. And we would then combine this with the other two facets to achieve a complete persona. This is where my talk was actually going to stop before I was accepted to speak at AliCamp. So we talked about the difficulties designing at the NDIA, and at the time, I actually didn't have an answer. However, since being accepted, I've rolled on to another project, and it's been quite interesting. So my team and I, we finished the planning portal, the last project. Again, I told you I'd stuff it up. We finished the last project and we rolled on to the participant portal project. Again, 3 Ps. Now, the participant portal is the digital system that participants on the scheme use to manage their budget. So you can log on to or jump onto a computer, and going through MyGov like you would for taxation, you can jump on, take a look at how much money you've got left in your budget, and you can also seek reimbursement for services that you've already paid for. Say you spent $70 at a physiotherapist, you can log on, upload a claim document or an invoice, and then receive that $70 back. Our objective, because they knew it wasn't as good as it could be, was to take a look at how we could improve that service. This project, though, unlike the last one, it gave us a lot more breathing room to speak to users. So these are some of the statistics based on that research. So we spoke with over 100 participants for this project alone, compared to the handful that were 10 or 15 that we'd spoken to previously. And of those participants, 100 participants, 40 of those meetings were face-to-face. By no means is this my first time in Sydney this year. I've been up and down the east coast of Australia more times than I'd like to count, and that finished with a trip to the Northern Territory earlier this year that I'll speak about in a minute. And this time, unlike the last project, we had the whole spectrum of disability open to us. When we were dealing with a project internal to the agency, like the Planning Pathways project, we were speaking to primarily people inside the business that either had a sensory disability or a physical disability. But now we're talking about a portal that is open to every Australian on the scheme, so we have to consider the full spectrum. This was quite daunting given where the last project left off in its complication. So as part of that, we ended up speaking to participants in the cognitive, the physical, the sensory, the caring space as well, if you're a carer for a participant, and we engaged the remote communities, which is primarily my trip to the Northern Territory. And it was really interesting what we found. So, hands up if you know what assistive technology is. Again, fantastic. I don't think you'd be here if you didn't. But again, I'll go over it just in case. So Assistive technology is really the barrier that sits, or not a barrier, but it's what sits in between the user and the system they're trying to integrate with. Think of it like a translator. Whatever the system is doing, the assistive technology is translating to make sure it's comprehensible by the person on the end. And it can take many forms, like speech to text, text to speech, zoom magnification, it can even be tactile on a computer. But what we found when we went out and spoke to participants face to face, almost unanimously, was that none of them had accessibility-based problems with the system that was currently implemented. And this is something that we'd been brought on to look at, and our assumption was we'd been brought on to look at it. It's the National Disability Insurance Agency. These guys have to be the bee's knees in accessibility, and that's why we're here. But that's not what the problem was. The problem was actually the processes that sit inside that system. So this graphic on the right that I want to describe, it's 3 people looking over a fence, watching a soccer game. These 3 people are all of differing heights, and some of them are standing on crates, some of them aren't. But because they stand on crates, they can all see over the fence. And I think this is a really important metaphor for what was going on here. At face value, without the crates, they all have differing levels of difficulty for seeing over the fence. However, if the crates represent assistive technology, really it's bringing everyone up to a level playing field. So everyone can interact with the soccer game to the same extent. The soccer game being the NDIA. The soccer game being the portal for the NDIA. However, what we found was the problem was not the crates. The crates are doing their job fantastically. Assistive technology was working, everyone could interact with the portal. The problem was the portal itself and how much value was actually in there. It's as if the soccer game, everyone's throwing water bombs around and every so often a whistle goes off but no one stops play. Like no one knows what's going on. And it doesn't matter that everyone can see over the fence with assistive technology, the value isn't there anymore because no one can understand the soccer game. And this is the problem that we found with the portal. Things like, I can't access my budget easily and view how much money is left over. I can't upload a document in relation to a claim, yet that's what I'm told I'm meant to do. Now, these aren't problems that are unique to the disability community or the accessible community by any means. Any human being interacting with the portal would have the same problems. So we kind of came to reform what we were thinking. Said, it's no longer about the accessible problems because that's not what's cropping up as part of our interviews. It's the human problems that we need to solve. We need to get the underlying system right first. I said, regardless of the disability needs, where is the value in making a system accessible if it's not usable first? How can I possibly solve for the unique needs of accessibility if I don't solve for the unique needs of humans first? Little did I know that the last stop on my trip would be the most evident example of this possible. So it kind of clicked after a while. We're taught very early on at the agency, there's a program that you have to go through. And kind of the motto of that program is see the person, not the disability. Now, as a user experience designer, when you're put into a situation and you've got no one to talk to, you do make some assumptions and you typically start to work backwards and validate those assumptions later down the track. And sadly, just a nature of big business and everyone wanting something done today. But this is where it clicked. I said, we can't solve for the accessibility problems without solving for the human first. And all these problems that we're experiencing, everything that we're hearing from the participants as we go further and further up the coast of Australia, only about 2 in 40 of them were accessibility-related problems. So those problems are starting to form something quite unique to the user versus something experienced by the group. There's an audio clip that I want to play by Adrian, and it really exemplifies this. So the audio's not great though. So.
It says it's something about $1,560, and I looked at my plan, and I've got that. So when I questioned, what's this 1,560, what's it for? They said, low-level support.
What that
And so what does that mean? It was not specifically clear enough, for example, a doorbell or a CCTV or a computer device, communication device. It wasn't clear. I had to look at all this up myself. And that was hard work. And so that leads me to think that how many deaf people are going to be doing what I did.
So this is an interview, because I record all our interviews with participant consent. This is an interview with a deaf man called Adrian. And what Adrian was asking, if you missed it there, is, I've got funding, and this funding is for a low-level support. But what's a low-level support? Can anyone here tell me what a low-level support is? You can't, because it's a human problem. It's not an accessibility-based problem. No one knows what a low-level support means. If I wanted to go out and get a Fitbit and it cost me $200, it's probably not a low-level support. But if it goes on sale at JB, is it a low-level support? It's like asking if a tree falls in the woods. It doesn't make any sense. Anyway, so as I said, I went to Northern Territory and I found that the human problems we were starting to hear about were really exemplified by the NT. So as part of my trip to the Northern Territory, we touched base in Darwin, Katherine, and a place called Groote Eylandt. Now, I can't assume where everyone is from here, but you're all in Sydney. So Sydney's like this. Darwin is probably this. Katherine is this, only because it has McDonald's. Groote Eylandt is like this. Groote Eylandt is tiny. And for the most part, what we heard in Darwin and in Katherine were relatively the same thing. Human problems, a bit more removed from the east coast of Australia. People wanting to engage with providers, but there are no providers around to engage with because not everyone wants to work in Darwin, and that's okay. But the people in the remote Indigenous communities took this problem of human-based problems and they absolutely ran with it. So the two big things that are problems in remote communities are that the Indigenous community is disengaged or unengaged with the National Disability Insurance Scheme. The reason being is that they're not necessarily trustworthy of outsiders, and so you have to make an engagement very early on, have someone introduce you. But beyond that, when they were engaged, they were spending most of their money on either food or respite, respite being travel to Darwin or travel to Cairns for kind of a day off. And the reason being is they don't have reliable access to food. There's a shop, but it can be closed 3 days in a week, in which case they try and get food wherever they can. So this is what they're using their funding for. And some of you may be asking, why is Maslow's hierarchy of needs up there? If you know it's Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's great. But Maslow's hierarchy of needs is really, it's like the food pyramid. It basically outlines what we need to be a fulfilled human being, starting with physiological needs, safety-based needs. So physiological being the need to sleep, the need to eat. Safety being the need to feel safe and have a safe place to live. Love and belonging, being part of a community or a family. Esteem for oneself. And then self-actualization. So the process of, like, I have a purpose in life. Not many people get that high up the pyramid. What we were seeing in the Northern Territory in these remote communities was a lack of the physiological. They don't have food. Or a lack of safety. The people going on respite would often go on respite because they'd gotten into an altercation, or they wanted to interact with the wider community. So maybe love and belonging. I don't know how many people have had a plan put together with the NDIA, but when you do, they ask you, what are the goals you want to achieve? Goals sit up the top of that pyramid. Goals are the self-actualization. What is your purpose? How can we possibly solve for goals when the underlying needs of physiological and safety aren't yet solved for? We're jumping the gun. Now, I'm not saying it's the NDIA's responsibility to provide food and to provide respite. What I am saying, though, is that trying to solve higher up on the pyramid is not likely to occur until those needs are met. And so what does all this mean now? I'm still working with the NDIA. I'm still working on the Participant Portal project. But we've taken a new approach. If I could talk to myself 18 months ago, I would tell myself to produce a human persona first. A persona that captures what is necessary for humans to understand technology. And then only by doing that will I then build upon it. And then I would say, okay, well now we need to add the layers of accessibility now that we've got this common understanding. And only when I get to the top of the cake and put that chocolate frosting on top of it do I actually deploy. Everyone loves cake. Everyone loves chocolate frosting. The researchers confirmed that. It doesn't matter how accessible we make a system if we don't get the underlying usability right first. And that usability is common to everyone because everyone is human. This is a process we're taking now to our work at the NDIA and with DB results. It's been a massive learning experience, and I didn't think I'd ever be in such a position to understand such complicated demographics. But at the end of the day, I applied my process, and I found that really it's not a complicated demographic at all, because first and foremost, we're all human. That's my talk. Thanks. I'll be around the conference this week. If anyone's got any questions, I'm very approachable.